I will begin at the scene everyone in the neighborhood pretends not to remember, but will talk about for years because that is how American suburbs truly work. It is a Sunday dusk in Cedar Hollow, 20 minutes north of Dallas. Sky the color of a dusty peach, and the smell of mesquite smoke drifting above the roofs like a low hymn. My name is Cole Whitaker, and I am standing at our cedar privacy fence holding my wife Hannah's nightgown, like a surrender flag, except I'm not surrendering. I am shaking. Across from me, in the yard trimmed into military perfection, stands our neighbor, Grant Clark, in an ironed polo and boat shoes as if he is auditioning to be promoted by the Homeowners Association into some ornamental position that comes with a gold star. Grant does not look at the nightgown. He looks at me. His mouth slides into that sly curve that has haunted me in dreams for 2 weeks. When he returned the gown that afternoon, he had handed it over folded once, creased straight as a ruler, and said in the most casual voice, "Found this on our side of the fence." Now the barbecue is over, the cul-de-sac children have been herded into baths, and the sprinklers tick and hiss in unison, like the neighborhood is breathing through a machine. The nightgown lifts in the breeze, and I see the tiny hand-stitched initials on the hem, the ones Hannah made years ago, before our arguments turned into long silences, and our long silences turned into the sound of the garage door groaning at midnight while one of us pretended to sleep. You would think the story begins when the nightgown vanishes, but that would be too neat. The story truly begins when the nightgown returns and returns with a smile. That smile is a knife that carves time into a before and an after. Before, ordinary suburban rhythms, H-E-B grocery aisles, Astros highlights on the television, a Whataburger bag on the passenger seat, the lint smell of a Saturday load tumbling in the dryer. After, suspicion as a diet, paranoia as protein, revenge as dessert. I could tell you the version where I stay dignified, where I call the police and deliver measured statements, but that version would be a lie. The truth is that I burned. I burned in the exact American way men burn when they have never learned a language for fear, only a language for control. 2 weeks earlier, the gown vanished on its first day back on the line since spring. We had bought a stackable washer, but Hannah said line drying made cotton feel like a Sunday morning, and she wanted to save on electricity, to be the kind of neighbor who lowers her carbon footprint and compliments other people's flower beds. I remember the day because the Dallas heat finally uncurled. A breeze came down the alley like a blessing, and the yard smelled faintly of tide and cut St. Augustine grass. I had cracked a Bud Light and stood there listening to the high school marching band practice over on Ridgeview, and the gown just fluttered once and went still like a flag at attention. That night, the motion light flickered. The dog that lives 3 houses down did that sad single bark that is not an alarm bark, more like a curious question. In the morning, the gown was gone, clothespins in place, sigh in my throat. On the fence post, a smear the color of metal. On the ground, a faint shoe print angled toward Clark's yard, sole pattern like cross-hatched fish scales. When I told Hannah, she blinked once, then reached for coffee and said she must have knocked it off, reaching for towels. I did not believe her. She did not believe herself. The silence that followed that sentence had the heavy scripted taste of lines we had both rehearsed. I bought a doorbell camera that afternoon, the kind with a wide lens that turns neighbors into flat actors on a stage of cracked concrete. I added 2 motion sensors to the side yard and a cheap game camera to the crepe myrtle, the trunk of which is as smooth as a polished leg. A man at the big box store asked if I hunted, and I said I hunted peace of mind. He laughed too loudly, looked at my cart, and offered me a discount on a floodlight, as if light could solve the dark. We went to the next homeowners association meeting, where there were the usual speeches about trash bins and mailbox paint standards, and I watched Grant tilt his head each time the president spoke, the way a man tilts his head when he already knows the answer to the question. When we left, Hannah said the evening air felt thin, and I blamed the ragweed and she blamed the way I stared. For the next 13 nights, my life shrank into a grid. I learned the patterns of headlights gliding along our cul-de-sac like curious fish. I learned that the teenager on the corner sneaks out at 1 a.m. to sit in his truck and FaceTime a girl because his parents confiscate the phone at midnight. I learned that Amazon drivers move with a choreography that belongs to a faster century. I learned that when insomnia chews a man down to the wire, the smallest sounds become messages, and he starts reading the world like a conspiracy board. On the 9th night, I heard footsteps on the gravel between our fence and the neighbors. The camera caught a shoulder and a slice of jaw. The jaw looked like it had grown a smile in a previous life. I went outside holding a flashlight and the bat I keep by the back door, as if I am the kind of man who believes in bats. The footfalls stopped. I scanned the fence slats. I saw nothing. I felt that I had been seen. Then the afternoon came when Grant knocked and placed the nightgown in my hands and said that line about finding it on his side of the fence. He said it in the voice men use to say they found a wallet on a sidewalk. He said it in the voice a magician uses when he pretends your card reappeared by accident in his palm. His mouth carried the tiniest smile, not generous, not kind, more like a private joke he had been waiting to tell to himself. Hannah stood behind me, and the color drained out of her face until she looked like a still photograph. Grant's wife, a tidy woman with lashes as precise as the vinyl numbers on their mailbox, waved from their driveway as if to prove everything was gentle. There was a second where I considered thanking him, and in that second I felt my whole life widen and almost heal. Then I saw that smile again, and I felt the wound choose to stay open. I tell you all of this because you must understand the temperature of my blood when the curtain rises on what happened next. I did not begin with fury. I began with a desire to make the world fit a sentence. Either Grant took it, or he did not. A clear story, a verdict, a punishment. That is how men like me are raised by television and locker rooms and the romantic myth of Texas justice. But the suburbs are a theater of ambiguity. They are a place where men will speak in the kindest tone while moving your property line half an inch every year. They are a place where the phrase, neighbor revenge, is whispered with a laugh, like a naughty dessert at a church potluck. But there is a ledger in every laugh, and the ledger always gets balanced. So when I stood at that fence at dusk on the barbecue night, nightgown snapping softly, beer cans cooling in a blue Yeti, and Grant watched me with that smile that said he would die before giving me the satisfaction of being certain, I made the most American choice available to me. I chose a story that would give me motion. I chose a story that would make me the main character. I chose revenge. You would expect a responsible man to call the police, to print photographs from the cameras, to organize evidence into polite folders, but responsibility had already floated down the alley like a wayward grocery receipt. I went with a plan that felt righteous in my bones, which is the same place rage lives and the same place bad country songs come from. The plan began with what any Texas man considers nature, tools, food, the magic of gossip, and the theater of the backyard. First came the lights. I installed them myself on a Saturday, 3 of them arrayed along the fence line, motion activated, bright enough to wash the lawn silver. I wanted the night to be interrogated. I wanted the moon to feel obsolete. I added a small siren that would chirp if anything moved between midnight and dawn, and then ping my phone with a cheerful message that said, "Movement detected near East Perimeter," a phrase that turned my lawn into a battlefield and me into a captain. Hannah watched me from the kitchen window, fingertip pressed to her lips, and I read her tenderness as judgment, because that was the language I was fluent in. When I came in for water, she asked if I wanted to talk, and I answered that I already was, and she said that I was not. Then I went to church. I had not been a regular since the year we lost the baby, but I went that Sunday because the church foyer is a marketplace of truth wearing the costume of mercy. I shook hands, I nodded at small talk, and then near the coffee urn I leaned toward a man who does pest control, and toward a woman who leads vacation Bible school. And I spoke quietly, like a man almost embarrassed. I said there had been an incident. I said a piece of my wife's clothing had turned up in the yard next door. I did not call it a nightgown because I was not ready to be that intimate in public, so I called it an item, which had the effect of making it sound more scandalous. I said I hoped it was the wind. I said I hoped we all could laugh about it someday. The man with pest control eyebrows lifted them and said he had never trusted Clark's garage parties. The woman tilted her head and breathed out through her nose the way Southern women breathe when they are too polite to shout. I did not say the word neighbor revenge out loud, but the phrase thrummed between us like a bass line. In the parking lot, I watched information leave my mouth and walk itself from sedan to truck like a dog returning home. In the afternoon, I went to the diner on Coit Road where they keep the coffee hot and the pie sincere, and I left a simple packet on the counter near the register. Inside were printed photos of the crease in the gown, a still from the camera with that slice of jaw, a page with timestamps, and a sticky note that said, "Wind is a patient thief." The owner, Carmen, looked at me with a face I could not read, and tucked the packet under the register with a soft hand. By that evening, 3 neighbors had texted to ask if everything was all right, if we needed anything, if we wanted them to keep an eye on unusual movement. I felt loved in the way a man feels loved when the village sharpens its knives for him. The feeling is not love, but it is close enough to warm the hands. Somewhere in there, Hannah said, "Cole, I feel exposed." And I said, "That is the point." And she said, "No, I feel exposed." And she pressed the gown into my hands, and I understood that my plan was already costing me the person I claimed to protect. So I adjusted. I told myself I would build a fortress so beautiful that safety would feel like apology. I replaced the latch on the side gate with a keypad. I resealed the fence slats and stamped our address into the wood with a branding iron so I could tell if any piece of it went missing and reappeared in the wrong yard. I began to water at strange hours, so I would have a reason to be outside looking casual with a hose, which is the suburban version of carrying a rifle on a frontier. In Texas, a man with a hose is allowed to stare. Grant pretended not to notice any of it. He waved with cheerful precision every time he reversed his boat into the driveway. He arranged his recycling bin like a stage prop. He hosted a barbecue where the rub on the brisket tasted like the word professional. And at that barbecue, he never once looked at me directly, which was either good manners or a calculated refusal to give me energy. His wife Melissa served beans, her bracelets chiming like polite wind, and asked Hannah about teaching, and Hannah answered in those clipped lines schoolteachers use when they are too tired to perform sweetness. I excused myself to the side yard at one point and saw a freshly clipped flower on our side of the fence. A pink zinnia lay delicately on the mulch. I picked it up like evidence, and in my head a drum began that sounded like a word: escalation. So I escalated back in a way that felt both childish and biblical. At midnight, I opened a small can of sardines and slipped the fish into 3 empty beer cans and placed them under the slats near Grant's grilling station. I told myself I was teaching him the scent of boundaries. I printed glitter bombs, the kind that release their contents with a memorable explosion when the envelope is opened, and I addressed them to his garage club under the jovial name of a fake fantasy football league. I did not think of myself as cruel. I thought of myself as clever. The distinction kept me warm. The next morning, my phone pinged with movement detected near East Perimeter, and I watched, live, a raccoon perform a delicate ballet along the fence, paws soft as fingertips. I laughed out loud in the kitchen, a kind of bark, and Hannah said, "This is not a game." And I said, "It is absolutely a game." And she said, "Then you are losing." And I stepped outside because I did not know how to answer the way you answer someone you love when you are already married to your performance. By the end of the week, there were rumors traveling through Cedar Hollow like migrating birds. Someone said there had been a peeping incident last summer over on Plum Hollow. Someone said Grant was pathologically neat to cover for a part of himself that had gone to seed. Someone said the smile was a nervous tick. Someone said the smile was a tell. Every theory made my bones light. I went to the hardware store for screws and came home with a roll of yellow caution tape because I wanted the yard to look like a crime scene in a television show. I wanted to be the detective and the grieving husband and the narrator of the series all at once. Americans love roles, and revenge is a role that fits like a jacket. Then came the night before the neighborhood cookout when I tested the siren, checked the camera angles, and stood at the fence staring into the dark, like a ship captain trying to read the edge of the world. The air was so still, I could hear the electric hum of the pool pump. In that silence, a sentence bloomed. Perhaps he did not take it. I almost watered the flower beds with that thought and let it sink into the dirt, to grow into a calmer man. Then a shadow crossed the slats, brief as a sigh, and a shoe scuffed the gravel again, and the sentence died on the vine. When the day of the cookout arrived, someone placed a folding table exactly halfway between our lawns, like a demarcation line, and the children chalked a sun in the middle of the street, and the teenagers wore hoodies that made them look like vague sorcerers. I brought a stack of paper plates. I brought salsa. Inside the house, on the kitchen counter, the nightgown lay folded as if it had folded itself. There was a moment I cannot explain, a moment like a cue, when I picked up the nightgown and walked outside and felt every muscle in my neck turn into a wire. The conversations paused. The music went a notch quieter. Hannah called my name once, twice, but the syllable did not reach my ear. I lifted the gown and slapped it down on the table, so the hem fluttered like a small white flag. I said, "This was found in my neighbor's yard," and I pointed at Grant, who looked up with that smile that now owned real estate in my sleep. and the whole cul-de-sac held its breath, the way people hold their breath when a magician is about to reveal whether the sawed woman can still walk. What I did next felt reasonable to me and would later sound ridiculous when repeated by other people in tones of horrified delight. That is the problem with neighbor revenge. In the heat of it, you believe you are balancing a scale. In the retelling, you sound like a man building a seesaw over a bottomless pit. I told the story of the disappearance and return with clinical detail. Timestamps like mile markers, the crease like a signature, the smear on the fence post like a footprint cast in bronze. I did not mention the raccoon, because I had already cast that part. I did not mention the possibility of wind, because I had already subpoenaed the sky and found it guilty. I said I wanted an explanation. I said I was ready for grace if the explanation was good. I said these words as if I had rehearsed them, because I had. Grant let me finish. He took a long, theatrical sip of beer. He glanced at Melissa, whose face had the polite firmness of a woman staging calm in a room full of antlers. He looked back at me and said, "Cole, I think you know the wind can be weird." He tilted his head toward the gutter like he was confiding in gravity. "Sometimes things hop fences," he said, and the smile returned, that small private theater at the corner of his mouth. "But if you want an apology, I am sorry the wind uses my lawn." Laughter rippled through the crowd the way a cough travels through a church, small and guilty and contagious. Someone said, "That is a good line, man." And the someone was a person who has never had their insides laid on a card table. I felt the sudden fury of a man who hears a catchy chorus during his own trial. I pressed forward and said, "Then explain the crease." And I lifted the gown like evidence, and he shrugged and said, "I fold things when I find them." And a woman near the potato salad said, "He does fold like that." And in that second I saw what I was up against was not a neighbor, but a folklore. Grant was not a man. He was a story everyone preferred to tell because it made their own front yards feel stable. The suburban ecosystem was choosing a version of events that would require the least maintenance. That realization mutated my anger into something operatic. If the neighborhood required theater, I would give them epic. So I began to describe the broader pattern, the gliding figure on the camera, the flower placed like a calling card, the fish scale soul. I hinted at other items in other yards, at rumors from Plum Hollow, at the garage gatherings where the lights burned bluish until 2 in the morning, men speaking in low voices about things that would not survive the sunlight. I said, and here my voice deepened without permission, that the suburbs had a cult. I described a secret covenant to steal small, soft things from clotheslines and laundry rooms and to exchange them as tokens, not for lust, but for power, the way knights exchange scarves and modern men exchange business cards. I spoke a sentence that made 3 women gasp because it had the ring of satire and blasphemy. I said there were rites involving dryer lint. Someone laughed the nervous laugh that means a door has opened to a room that smells like both perfume and gasoline. I saw Hannah's face, a small, pale moon behind the crowd, and I knew I had lost the version of myself who held grief quietly. So, I committed to this version. I sketched the binders I had assembled, the diagrams, the lines of red twine, the maps of alley currents, and a neighbor named Derek asked if I was serious, and I said, "Serious enough to end it." And he said, "End what?" And I said, "The cult." Yeah, I told them I had already begun to strike back. Small, precise blows that would make the night smell wrong until the thieves lost their appetite. I said some of the garage faithful might have received packages that released a shimmering cloud upon opening, a reminder that what goes around comes back with confetti. And 2 men looked at each other with the comical guilt of boys who have recently done a minor prank and just realized they are not the only mischief in town. The scene tilted then, as if the cul-de-sac itself had decided to lean toward entertainment. A phone dinged, then another, then a chorus. People lifted their screens and read a message from the Homeowners Association president, a man named Rick who was in San Antonio at a baseball tournament with his son. The message said, in measured tones and apostrophes, that there had been reports of a privacy incident and a celebratory flare of glitter, and that the board kindly requested all future grievances be routed through proper channels. The message added, with that polite menace only an association can muster, that fines would begin on Monday for non-compliant lighting schemes and unregistered sirens. The crowd buzzed. Someone shouted, "Turn off the floodlights, Batman!" And I could not tell if the voice wanted to hurt me or wanted to be saved. Grant set down his beer and stepped closer to the table, The smile now widened into something almost kind. He touched the gown with 2 fingers, like a priest blessing a wafer, and said, "Cole, man to man, I think you need rest." And the phrase felt like a syringe sliding air into my vein. I said, "Man to man, I think you need to tell me why you returned it with that smile." And he said, "It was a funny thing." And I said, "It was not funny." And Melissa said, "Gentlemen?" And Hannah said my name again, and this time it hit the back of my neck like a cold hand. And then, because drama wants a climax the way July wants heat, the siren on my tin yard trilled one bright chirp, and every head turned toward the fence. For 2 seconds, nothing moved. Then the raccoon prowled into sight, plump as a pillow, tail banded like a prison uniform, and the entire neighborhood exhaled the way a theater audience exhale when the villain is revealed to be a cat. Someone laughed, and then 7 someones laughed, and then the laughter became a wave that washed over the table and carried away the gravity I had spent 2 weeks stockpiling. I wanted to shout that the raccoon was only the decoy, that the true thief always sends an animal to receive the sting of a trap. I wanted to remind them that empires fall because men tell jokes at the wrong moment, but the sound was too big. I stood in the middle of it with the nightgown in my hand, and for the first time I saw the scene from above, the way a drone camera would float and film it. And the ridiculousness reached me like a faint radio station, and I hated it. And I almost smiled, and I hated that more. The children began to chalk raccoons on the street sun, and a teenager filmed me from behind his sleeve. And I stared at Grant's smile and realized it had gained new power, because now it could say, "I told you so," without moving. I did the only thing left that felt like action. I announced that if the neighborhood preferred to laugh, then the neighborhood would require a larger spectacle before it understood the cost of mocking a man in his own yard. I said there would be a demonstration. I said it in a voice I wish I did not recognize as my father's voice. I picked up the nightgown and raised it like a flag and promised that by sundown tomorrow, every person on this cul-de-sac would understand that peace is a choice paid in advance by someone else's restraint, and that when restraint is exhausted, peace closes its account. If you have read this far, hoping for the brand of justice that arrives with a siren and ends with spotless clarity, I will disappoint you. If you are hoping for a fire that burns away doubt, I can almost satisfy you. Morning began with the neighborhood pretending the previous night had been a performance piece from an artist visiting from out of state. Sprinklers rotated, packages arrived like obedient pigeons. Lawnmowers stitched the air. I made coffee and did not drink it. Hannah stood near the sink and held the nightgown with both hands as if it were a passport. She asked me to stop. She said the word stop in a way that reached muscle and bone. I kissed her forehead and lied to her politely, the way a man lies when he wants to spare someone from his own momentum. I built the demonstration like a man constructs a sermon. I printed the photographs and laminated them, which made them ridiculous and therefore perfect for suburban consumption. I hung them along the fence with clothespins, so that even the evidence looked like laundry. I set up the projector that I had bought for football season and connected it to my phone. I created a slideshow I named Wind, with dramatic fades and captions in a font that belongs on courthouse documents. I placed the grill in the center of the yard like an altar. On the grill, I stacked a small pyramid of scrap oak from the garage and a log of pecan so the smoke would smell like dessert. In a metal bowl, I placed the nightgown folded once, crease visible. I located a Bible because I believed that true theater in Texas always requires scripture somewhere near the stage, and I underlined a verse about hidden things being revealed, and I am not proud of that choice, but it is honest. Around 4, neighbors began to orbit the yard, the way birds gather on a wire when a storm is rumored. Some came for schadenfreude, some came for solidarity, some came because boredom in a cul-de-sac is a dangerous thing. I saw the teenager with his hoodie, and the girl from FaceTime without her screen, and the pest control man from church, and Carmen from the diner, who now looked like a journalist assigned to a human interest piece. Melissa appeared on the Clark side with deviled eggs because there is no conflict in Texas that cannot be softened by deviled eggs. Grant stood near her, hands in pockets, as composed as a man waiting at an airport gate, and when our eyes met, the smile did not appear. That, somehow, was worse. When a theater enemy removes his mask, the play either ends or begins. I cleared my throat and did not need to call for silence because the moment had already called it. I told the story again, but shorter. I showed the photographs, but I allowed the projector to linger on the timestamp that proved I am a man who is up at 2 in the morning alone and narrating the doorbell camera to himself. The crowd shifted, because pity is an awkward bench and nobody likes to be placed on it. I described the theory I had labeled the cult, but I let my voice rise into a smile so they might understand that I understood the absurdity, and more than one person's shoulders eased. I said the following sentence in language that embarrassed me, even as it left my mouth, because it was truth wrapped in melodrama, and I did not know how else to deliver it. I said I was tired of being held hostage by a mystery wearing a neighbor's face. I lifted the nightgown. I waited for that old smile to return and pin me to the earth like a thumbtack. It did not. The evening was so quiet that the neighborhood pool 2 blocks away sounded like the surf. I said, I am going to end the question, and I placed the nightgown in the metal bowl on the grill and I struck a match. The match flared and I held it the way a man holds a tiny sword, and then I hesitated. It is one thing to declare an ending. It is another to enact it in front of people who will remember forever how you looked when you finally chose. I looked at Hannah. Her face was not a plea anymore. It was a landscape of tired love and a decision of her own. I saw in that face the history of our empty nursery and the year of separate couches and the careful thaw that had begun when she stitched her initials in the hem of a new nightgown and reminded herself that softness still existed. I saw the weapon I was making of her softness. Coal, she said, and that was all. One syllable. It contained a lifetime. I thought then of every country song that taught me a man must make a stand. And I thought of every time that education had delivered me to the edge of a cliff. And I thought of the laugh track that would follow my fall. And I made a choice that felt like betrayal and relief at the same time. I blew out the match. The crowd murmured. I could feel embarrassment dress me like a shirt. I lifted the bowl and handed it to Hannah and said, "You decide." And my voice did not shake, and that, somehow, was mercy I did not know I had stored. Then Grant stepped forward, and the air packed itself tighter. He said my name. He said it carefully, as if it might trigger something. He said he had a video I should see. He asked if he could airplay to the projector. The crowd made that noise Americans make when technology promises the revelation of truth. I felt my jaw tighten so hard it clicked. I handed him the remote. He connected his phone. On the fence appeared a home video of an afternoon 2 weeks ago. The angle looked familiar because it was the alley behind our houses. The camera faced my fence. A wind gust pushed across the screen like an invisible truck. The nightgown jumped, the clothespins held, then one pin gave and the fabric pivoted like a bird and flew up, caught on the top slat, hung for a second in a ballet of cotton, and then a second gust lifted the hem and the whole garment slid over the fence like a story sliding into a new genre. The video ended with Grant jogging into frame, picking up the gown, folding it once almost reflexively, glancing at the camera, and performing a tiny, "What can you do?" shrug. The smile was there. It was the smile men wear when the wind makes a joke, and they have to play the straight man. Nobody clapped. This was not that kind of movie. A few people exhaled through their teeth. I said nothing, because there was nothing for a long second that would not be an attempt at a new performance. Finally I said, "Why did you not show me this earlier?" And he said, "Because you did not ask to see it. You told me who I was." And I hated that sentence because it was visiting me from a manual about how to be a better person. He added, "Also I thought it was funny." And the smile tried to rise and did not quite make it, and he looked human for the first time in 2 weeks. Something unclenched in the crowd. A teenager said, "Well, dang," with the innocent cruelty of youth. Carmen from the diner said, "I've seen worse misunderstandings end in marriage," which made several heads swing toward her with the eager shock of people who will be discussing that line on porches later. Hannah stood with the bowl in her hands like an anchor she no longer needed. She set it down. She looked at me with a sadness that was not anger. It was more like the sadness of a teacher watching a student cheat himself out of an answer he almost earned. I cleared my throat. I said, "I am sorry," and I said it toward the neighborhood, toward Hannah, toward the raccoon, toward the version of myself I had marched out like a parade. I did not say it to Grant yet, because apology is not a coupon you redeem immediately for the prize of being forgiven. He nodded anyway. He said, "Truce," and held out his hand. And I did not take it. Not yet, because part of me wanted to hold what remained of my righteous anger, the way a boy holds a rock he has not thrown. Then something strange happened, the thing I will remember as the real magic of the suburbs. Neighbors stepped forward and began to dismantle the theater. Someone unplugged the projector. Someone else carried the folding chairs back to the garage. The pest control man gathered my laminated photos with the kindness of a person cleaning up after a party that got out of hand. The teenage boy drew a chalk raccoon that looked like a philosopher. The day was telling me to stand down. As the crowd thinned, I realized I still had a choice to make. Revenge had not disappeared. It had only been given new assignments. It could go underground, as it does in so many neighborhoods, where it calcifies into small punishments. Hedges trimmed aggressively, anonymous emails to the association, cars parked where puddles form, so splashback becomes a message. Or revenge could mutate into something harder and more useful, which is to say humility. I hated that word the way a man hates any tool he has not practiced using. But I saw another option, one I had not allowed myself to consider because it required grace, and grace is expensive. I could convert my rage into repair. I walked to the fence with the bowl and the gown. I set the bowl on the top slat. I folded the gown once, crease neat, not as a joke, but as a ritual concluding itself. I handed it to Hannah. I faced Grant and said his name, and it did not taste like an accusation anymore. I said, "I will fix the lights." And he said, "Keep them if they make you feel safe." And I realized he had been learning something too. We stood there, two men who had almost built a war out of cotton and wind. I said to him, "I will try to be a better neighbor." And he said, "So will I." And it was not a contract, but it was a start. That night, I took down the caution tape. I left one motion sensor up because peace does not require blindness. I slept without checking the camera. The raccoon visited and nobody announced it. In the morning, Hannah brewed coffee and said the house smelled like we had moved back in. I went outside and watered the lawn with the gentleness of a man who finally understands a hose is not a weapon. As the spray arced over the fence, I saw Grant in his yard not smiling, just existing, as if the whole story had not needed him as protagonist or villain after all. I almost laughed, and then I did, and the sound startled a bird and I watched it fly, and I thought that, in a place like Cedar Hollow, where people choose their narratives like they choose their siding, sometimes the bravest neighbor revenge is no revenge at all, or it is the kind that chooses to close the account before anybody else pays the fee. I wish I could tell you the story ends with friendship bracelets and backyard double dates. It does not. It ends with a working truce and a neighborhood that returns to pretending it does not know how to tell stories about itself. But in the quiet that followed, I discovered the final secret. The nightgown had always been less the object than the mirror. It had shown me the man I had become, a man who believed his rage was proof he was alive. That night in bed, Hannah smoothed the fabric with her palm and said we might go away for a weekend, just the two of us, and I said yes the way a man says yes to oxygen. Outside, the fence held the night the way the horizon holds the day. The wind moved through the alley without an audience. The cameras rested. The neighborhood slept. And somewhere a raccoon, plump and philosophical, wandered its small kingdom under the moon, unthanked and undefeated.